The morning of September 21st started like any other day at Arlington National Cemetery. Staff Sergeant Michael Rodriguez adjusted his pristine white gloves one final time before stepping onto the sacred ground. The tomb of the unknown soldier stood before him, a marble monument that had witnessed decades of unwavering dedication from the elite guards who protected it. Rodriguez had been guarding the tomb for 3 years now. Every step he took was measured, every movement precise. 21 steps south, turn and face east for 21 seconds. Turn and face north for 21 seconds, then 21 steps north. This ritual had been performed continuously since 1937 through world wars, natural disasters, and every kind of weather imaginable. The weather forecast that morning had been concerning. Hurricane Isabel was making its way up the East Coast, and meteorologists predicted it would hit the Washington, D.C. area by late afternoon. Dark clouds were already gathering on the horizon, and the wind was picking up steadily. As Rodriguez began his shift, he noticed several tourists gathering despite the threatening weather. Families with children, elderly veterans, and young couples all came to pay their respects to the unknown soldiers who represented all those who had made the ultimate sacrifice for their country. Many of them seemed unaware of just how severe the approaching storm would become. The tomb itself seemed to stand defiantly against the darkening sky. Carved into the white marble were the words, "Here rests in honored glory, an American soldier known but to God." These words carried the weight of countless stories, countless families who never got to say goodbye, countless heroes whose names were lost to history, but whose sacrifice would never be forgotten. Rodriguez felt the first drops of rain as he completed his southward march. The droplets were cold against his face, but his expression remained stoic. Nothing could break the concentration required for this sacred duty. The crowd of visitors began to shift uncomfortably, some opening umbrellas, others pulling out raincoats they had brought just in case. A young boy, perhaps 8 years old, tugged on his mother's sleeve and asked loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Mommy, why doesn't the soldier go inside when it rains?" His mother shushed him gently, but the question hung in the air. Several other visitors seemed curious about the same thing. An elderly man wearing a Vietnam veteran's cap stepped forward slightly, as if to explain to those around him. "Son," he said to the boy, "that guard doesn't leave his post, no matter what. Rain, snow, hurricanes, nothing stops them. They've been doing this for over 80 years without missing a single day." The wind grew stronger, causing the American flag nearby to snap and flutter violently. Rodriguez continued his measured pace, each step deliberate and respectful. His uniform remained immaculate despite the increasing moisture in the air. Years of training had prepared him for this moment, though he had never experienced a storm quite like what was approaching. As the minutes passed, the sky grew darker and more ominous. The temperature began to drop, and the wind carried the scent of rain and electricity that comes before a major storm. Some visitors started to leave, seeking shelter in their cars or nearby buildings. But a surprising number remained, drawn by curiosity about what would happen when the full force of the hurricane arrived. Rodriguez could feel the eyes of the crowd upon him as he executed his turn at the south end of his route. Every movement was a testament to the discipline and honor that defined the old guard, the unit responsible for guarding the tomb. These soldiers were selected not just for their physical abilities, but for their unwavering commitment to duty and their ability to perform under any circumstances. The first real gust of wind hit, just as he was facing east for his 21-second pause. His uniform jacket fluttered, but he remained perfectly still, his rifle held in the exact position required by regulation. In that moment, Rodriguez embodied everything the unknown soldiers represented: duty, honor, sacrifice, and an unbreakable commitment to something greater than oneself. The radio crackled to life in Rodriguez's earpiece just as the rain began to fall in earnest. "Sentinel-1, this is command. Hurricane Isabel is intensifying faster than predicted. Winds are expected to reach 75 miles per hour within the next 30 minutes. You are ordered to secure your post and seek immediate shelter. Rodriguez heard the command clearly, but his feet continued their measured march. 21 steps north, turn, face the tomb. The rain was no longer just drops, but a steady downpour that soaked through his white cotton gloves and began to dampen his uniform. The tourists who remained were now huddled under whatever shelter they could find, many taking cover under the nearby trees or behind the marble columns of the amphitheater. Sentinel 1, do you copy? This is a direct order. Abandon your post immediately and report to the visitor center. The voice in his earpiece was more urgent now, tinged with genuine concern for his safety. For the first time in his 3 years of service at the tomb, Rodriguez faced a decision that went against everything he had been trained to do. The old guard had a sacred motto: soldiers never die, they just go to hell and regroup. But more than that, they had an unspoken promise to the unknown soldiers they protected. That promise was simple: we will never leave you alone. The crowd of remaining visitors watched in fascination and growing concern as the storm intensified around the lone figure in white. Water streamed down Rodriguez's face, but his expression remained unchanged. His movements were still precise, still measured, still perfect, despite the increasingly dangerous conditions. A news reporter, who had been covering a different story at the cemetery, noticed what was happening and began recording. On her phone, she had heard stories about the dedication of the tomb guards, but seeing it firsthand during a hurricane was something else entirely. She narrated quietly to her camera, "I'm here at Arlington National Cemetery, where a tomb guard is continuing. His duty, despite direct orders to seek shelter from Hurricane Isabel." The wind picked up dramatically, causing debris to blow across the plaza. Small branches and leaves swirled around Rodriguez as he maintained his vigil. His white uniform, usually pristine and sharp, was now completely soaked. But somehow, this only made his dedication more visible, more real to those watching. Among the crowd, an elderly woman began to cry. She had lost her husband in World War II, and his body had never been recovered. To her, the unknown soldiers represented her beloved husband and thousands of others like him. Seeing this young man refuse to abandon his post despite the danger moved her deeply. "Ma'am, we really should get you to safety," a cemetery security guard said, approaching the small group of remaining spectators, but the woman shook her head. "That boy isn't leaving," she said, pointing to Rodriguez. "If he's staying, I'm staying." The radio crackled again, this time with a different voice. It was Rodriguez's commanding officer, Colonel James Patterson. "Rodriguez, I'm giving you a direct order. This is not about protocol anymore. This is about your safety. Get to shelter now." But Rodriguez had made his decision. As he executed his turn at the north end of his route, he reached up and switched off his radio. The act was unprecedented, a clear violation of military discipline that could result in serious consequences. But in his mind, there was a higher duty at play. The storm was no longer approaching. It had arrived in full force. Rain fell in sheets so thick that visibility was reduced to just a few yards. The wind howled through the cemetery, bending trees and rattling the metal fixtures around the tomb. Lightning began to flash in the distance, followed by the rolling thunder that announced nature's full fury was about to be unleashed. Hurricane Isabel hit Arlington Cemetery with devastating force.
How the wind screamed across the marble plaza at nearly 80 miles per hour, driving the rain horizontally and turning it into thousands of tiny needles that stung any exposed skin.
Trees throughout the cemetery bent at impossible angles, and the sound was deafening. Rodriguez continued his march. His uniform was now completely soaked, clinging to his body like a second skin. Water poured from the brim of his cap, and his white gloves were transparent with moisture. But his rifle remained in perfect position, and his steps never wavered from their precise 21 count. The small crowd of spectators had taken whatever shelter they could find, and they refused to leave. They watched in amazement as this solitary figure continued his duty in conditions that would have sent most people running for cover. The elderly woman with the World War II veteran husband had found protection under a stone overhang, but her eyes never left the guard. "This is incredible," whispered a young father to his teenage son. They were crouched behind a marble memorial, rain pelting the stone above them. Do you understand what you're seeing? This is what real honor looks like. The teenager who had been reluctant to visit the cemetery in the first place found himself mesmerized by the scene. He had never seen such dedication, such unwavering commitment to duty. It was like watching a living statue, a human embodiment of the very principles. The tomb represented lightning flashed directly overhead, illuminating Rodriguez in stark white light for a split second. The thunder that followed was immediate and deafening. Several people in the crowd gasped, expecting the guard to finally seek shelter. But Rodriguez simply continued his march, as if the fury of nature itself was just another part of his duty. A maintenance worker from the cemetery tried to approach Rodriguez during one of his turns. "Sir, you need to get inside," he shouted over the wind. "This is dangerous." But Rodriguez, bound by the strict protocols of his duty, could not acknowledge the man's presence. He continued his routine as if the worker wasn't there. The news reporter continued filming, her hands shaking from cold and amazement. "I've been a journalist for 15 years, she said into her phone, rain making her camera lens blur. "I've covered wars, natural disasters, and historic events. But I've never seen anything like this. This guard is risking his life to honor the dead, defying direct orders to maintain a tradition that has never been broken." As the storm reached its peak intensity, something remarkable began to happen among the spectators. Despite the danger, despite the obvious need to seek shelter, more people began to arrive. Word was spreading somehow, perhaps through text messages or phone calls to friends and family. "You have to see this," they were saying. "There's a guard at Arlington who won't leave his post." A group of active-duty soldiers who had been visiting the cemetery rushed to the tomb area when they heard what was happening. When they saw Rodriguez continuing his duty in conditions that defied belief, they stood at attention in the rain, saluting their fellow servicemen. They understood better than anyone what his actions represented. The wind grew so strong that it became difficult for Rodriguez to maintain his balance during his turns. But he adapted, planting his feet more firmly, adjusting his stance slightly, while maintaining the dignity and precision of his movements. His training had prepared him for many things, but nothing quite like this. Water was now pooling around the base of the tomb, and the marble plaza had become treacherous. Each step required extra care to avoid slipping, but Rodriguez's pace never changed. He had internalized the rhythm so completely that it had become part of him. As natural as breathing, the storm seemed to recognize the defiance of this single human being and responded with even greater fury. But Rodriguez had made his choice, and nothing would move him from his post. What started as a handful of determined spectators was rapidly becoming something extraordinary. Despite the hurricane conditions, people were arriving at the tomb in increasing numbers. They came running through the rain from parking lots, from the visitor center, from all corners of the cemetery. Word had spread through social media, emergency radio broadcasts, and phone calls that something unprecedented was happening at Arlington. A retired Marine colonel named Robert Hayes fought his way through the wind and rain, his old bones protesting every step. When he reached the tomb area and saw Rodriguez still marching, tears mixed with rainwater on his weathered face. "Semper Fi, son," he whispered, even though Rodriguez couldn't hear him over the storm. The crowd now numbered in the hundreds, all of them soaked to the bone but unwilling to leave. They had created an impromptu shelter system, sharing umbrellas and raincoats, helping elderly visitors and children stay as dry as possible while maintaining their vigil. What had begun as casual tourism had transformed into something much more meaningful. Rodriguez is now in his second hour of defying the evacuation order. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and if anything, conditions were getting worse. His white uniform had become nearly transparent from the rain, and his movements had slowed slightly as hypothermia began to set in. But still, he marched. 21 steps south, turn. 21 seconds facing east, turn. 21 steps north. A paramedic team had arrived on scene, but they were ordered to maintain their distance unless Rodriguez actually collapsed. The cemetery officials were in a difficult position. couldn't force him to leave without physically removing him, which would be unthinkable given the sacred nature of his duty and the growing crowd of witnesses. Among the spectators, conversations were happening that would be remembered for years to come. A young woman who had been struggling with depression found herself inspired by Rodriguez's unwavering commitment. If he can do this, she thought, maybe I can get through my problems too. She had come to Arlington to visit her grandfather's grave, but she was leaving with something much more valuable: a group of Boy Scouts. Soaked and shivering, stood mesmerized by the display of duty before them. Their scoutmaster, a former Army sergeant, used the moment as a teaching opportunity. This is what duty really means, boys. It's not just a word in the scout law. It's something you do even when no one would blame you for quitting. The news crew that had been filming had called in additional reporters. Local television stations began interrupting regular programming to show live footage of the guard who wouldn't leave his post. The story was spreading beyond Arlington, beyond Washington, D.C., across the entire country. People in their warm, dry homes watched in awe as Rodriguez continued his vigil in conditions that most would consider impossible. Colonel Patterson arrived at the tomb personally, his uniform already drenched from running through the cemetery. He watched his soldier for several minutes, feeling a mixture of pride, frustration, and deep respect. Rodriguez was violating direct orders, but he was also upholding something even more important than military discipline. The colonel approached the rope barrier that kept visitors at a respectful distance from the tomb. He could have ordered the other guards to physically remove Rodriguez, but something stopped him. Perhaps it was the sight of the growing crowd, all of them standing in the hurricane to witness this display of dedication. Perhaps it was his own understanding of what the tomb represented. Lightning struck a tree less than 100 yards away, the crack of splitting wood audible even over the wind. Several people screamed and many dropped to the ground instinctively, but Rodriguez never flinched. He completed his turn, faced east for 21 seconds, and continued his march as if nothing had happened. That moment changed everything for the crowd. They realized they weren't just watching a stubborn soldier who wouldn't follow orders. They were witnessing something truly extraordinary, a display of dedication so pure and unwavering that it transcended normal human limitations. In a world where people often gave up when things got difficult, here was someone who simply refused to quit. As Rodriguez entered his third hour in the hurricane, something remarkable began to happen among the crowd. What had started as individual acts of witness was becoming a collective experience of profound meaning. People who had never spoken to each other were sharing umbrellas, offering warm coffee from thermoses, and creating human shields to protect the elderly and children from the worst of the wind. A group of active-duty soldiers had formed an informal honor guard of their own, standing at attention in the rain as a show of support for their fellow servicemen. They rotated in shifts, ensuring that Rodriguez always had military witnesses to his dedication. Their presence seemed to strengthen his resolve, though his face showed the strain of fighting both the elements and exhaustion. The storm reached its absolute peak intensity around this time. Wind gusts exceeded 90 miles per hour, and the rain was falling so hard that it created a white noise that drowned out most conversation. Debris flew through the air, and several small trees had already fallen in other parts of the cemetery. Emergency services had shut down most of the roads leading to Arlington. Somehow people kept arriving. Rodriguez's commanding officer, Colonel Patterson, made a decision that would define his own legacy. Instead of ordering the physical removal of his soldier, he stepped into the rain himself. The colonel took position near the tomb, not to relieve Rodriguez, but to stand with him. If his soldier was going to risk everything for duty, then his commanding officer would share that risk. The crowd erupted in spontaneous applause. When they saw the colonel join Rodriguez in the storm, it was a moment of pure military brotherhood, a demonstration that leadership meant standing with your people in their darkest hours, rather than commanding them from a safe distance. A family from Texas had been visiting Arlington as part of their vacation when the hurricane hit. They had taken shelter in their rental car, but the father, a former Navy petty officer, couldn't tear himself away from watching Rodriguez. Finally, he made a decision that surprised his wife and children. "I have to go stand with them," he told his family, He left the safety of the car and joined the crowd of witnesses. Adding his presence to the growing testament of support, the cemetery's chaplain, Father Michael O'Brien, arrived despite the dangerous conditions. He had served 3 tours in Iraq and understood the spiritual significance of what was happening. Without fanfare, he took position among the crowd and began to pray silently, not for the storm to end, but for strength for the young man who had chosen duty over safety. Rodriguez was now visibly struggling. The cold rain had soaked through every layer of his uniform, and his movements showed signs of the hypothermia that was setting in. His turns were slightly slower, his rifle grip less steady, but the precision never wavered. Every step was still, exactly measured. Every pause still exactly 21 seconds. A doctor in the crowd noticed Rodriguez's condition and alerted the paramedics. They moved closer, ready to intervene if he collapsed, but maintaining enough distance to respect the sanctity of his duty. The tension was becoming unbearable for many spectators who wanted to help but understood that interfering would dishonor what he was trying to accomplish. The wind reached a crescendo that seemed to test the very limits of what a human being could endure while maintaining military bearing. Rodriguez's cap was torn from his head and sent tumbling across the plaza, but he didn't break formation to retrieve it. His dark hair was plastered to his skull, and water streamed constantly from his uniform, but still he marched at this moment. Something spontaneous and beautiful happened among the crowd. Without any organization or planning, people began to count his steps aloud. 18, 19, 20, 21. Their voices rose above the storm, creating a human metronome that seemed to give Rodriguez additional strength. The counting spread through the entire crowd until hundreds of voices were moving in unison with the guard steps. It became a communal act of support, a way for all these strangers to participate in honoring the unknown soldiers. They couldn't stand guard themselves, but they could bear witness, and they could let Rodriguez know that he was not alone in his vigil. As Rodriguez completed another turn and began his southward march, the crowd's unified counting grew stronger. They had become part of the ceremony, part of the tradition, part of something larger than themselves. Rodriguez had created a moment that transcended individual courage and became a shared experience of what it means to truly honor those who sacrificed everything for others. After 4 hours in Hurricane Isabel, Rodriguez was reaching the limits of human endurance. His lips had turned blue from the cold, and his hands shook slightly despite his iron will to maintain perfect form. The storm had become a living thing, trying to claim him, but still he stood guard. The crowd, now numbering nearly 1,000 people, despite the impossible conditions, had become his strength. The moment that would be remembered forever came during his 127th turn at the south end of his route. As Rodriguez pivoted to face east, a massive gust of wind, stronger than any before it, struck him directly. For a terrifying instant, it looked like he might be knocked down. The crowd gasped collectively, hundreds of hearts stopping as one, but Rodriguez didn't fall. Instead, he planted his feet more firmly, gripped his rifle tighter, and stared straight ahead with such determination that it seemed to challenge the hurricane itself. In that moment, he wasn't just a soldier following orders or defying them. He had become something more, a living symbol of unbreakable commitment. The crowd's reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Spontaneous cheering erupted despite the howling wind. People were crying, hugging strangers, and applauding with hands that were numb from cold. A Vietnam veteran shouted, "Hoo!" at the top of his lungs. A young mother lifted her toddler so he could see the guard who wouldn't quit. An immigrant family who had become American citizens just months before stood with their hands over their hearts, finally understanding in the deepest possible way what their new country represented. Colonel Patterson, who had been watching with growing pride and concern, made an unprecedented decision. He approached the rope barrier and saluted his soldier in full view of the crowd. It was a public acknowledgement that sometimes the highest form of military discipline was knowing when to break the rules for something greater. The news footage was going viral across the internet. Hurricane Hero and the guard who wouldn't quit were trending on every social media platform. But for Rodriguez, none of that mattered. All that existed was his duty, his promise to the unknown soldiers, and the rhythm of his march that had become as essential as his heartbeat, as suddenly. As it had reached its peak, the hurricane began to weaken. The eye of the storm was passing over, creating an eerie calm that felt almost supernatural after hours of chaos. The rain slowed to a manageable drizzle, and the wind died down to occasional gusts. Rodriguez had weathered the worst of it, and he was still standing guard. The crowd realized what they had witnessed. They had seen a human being choose honor over safety, duty over comfort, service over self-preservation. They had watched someone embody the very best of what it means to be a guardian, a protector, a keeper of sacred trust. When Rodriguez's relief guard finally arrived 2 hours later, the crowd remained silent as the changing of the guard ceremony proceeded with perfect military precision. Rodriguez passed his rifle to the new sentinel, executed one final salute to the tomb, and then, for the first time in 6 hours, broke his concentration and looked at the crowd that had stood with him. What he saw brought tears to his eyes that had nothing to do with the rain. Nearly 1,000 people representing every age, race, and background imaginable, all looking at him with expressions of gratitude, respect, and awe. They began to applaud softly at first, then building to a crescendo that echoed across the cemetery. Rodriguez didn't speak. He simply nodded once, a small acknowledgement of their shared experience, and walked slowly toward the guard quarters. But the crowd remained, many of them staying for hours more, not wanting the moment to end. The story of the tomb guard who defied the hurricane became legendary. Rodriguez received numerous commendations, though he always insisted he was just doing his job. More importantly, his actions reminded an entire nation of what true service looks like. The video of his vigil was viewed millions of times, and countless young people were inspired to serve their communities and their country. But perhaps the most lasting impact was on the 1,000 people who stood in the rain with him that day. They had witnessed something that changed their understanding of dedication, honor, and the power of keeping faith with those who came before us. They learned that some promises are so sacred, some duties so important, that not even the fury of nature itself can break them. Years later, many of those witnesses would return to Arlington on the anniversary of Hurricane Isabel, not as tourists, but as pilgrims returning to a place where they had seen the very best of human nature. They would tell their children and grandchildren about the day they stood in a hurricane with a guard who wouldn't abandon his post, and how that experience taught them what it truly means to keep faith with those who sacrificed everything for others.